Hi everyone, Irene's Left Nut here, and today is the SSS tier list. Be sure to watch part 1 as well, but before I start talking about why your favorite character is trash, we need to understand what isn't trash and why. Enter stage right, Irene's forehead. Irene is a 6-star Swordmaster guard who somehow checks all 3 of my red flags. She's into maid outfits, she has a gun, and she's a woman. When it comes to SSS, the danger level is the reason enemies are strong, but Irene through various means can bypass all of it. Her talent, Hot and Scalding, completely nullifies the extra defense. Her levitation prevents enemies from getting close enough to hit on her, and her incredible damage comes in handy when enemies run at you as if you just smoked a hornet's nest with year-old Parasol Adderall. But ultimately, there are 2 things that distinguish Irene from everyone else in SSS: the uptime of her skill and the power of friendship. Irene's Judgment, when powered by 5 vanguards, charges every 15 seconds, living up to the name as a momentary lapse in judgment. This means enemies are almost continuously blasted into the stratosphere, flying so high they'll completely invalidate the entirety of Kristen's career. However, what you'll notice when we get into the tier list is that many lower tier operators also have great damage, strong crowd control, and have fantastic uptime. But what they don't have is the power of friendship on their side. Generally, Vanguard A and Sniper A are the go-to buffs in SSS because the operators are cheap, allowing you to play much faster. Remember in part 1 when I said play fast, finish faster? Well, playing fast doesn't only get you out of SSS sooner, it also means the danger level is lower, meaning enemies are easier to kill. This is why speed is of the essence in stationary security service, and since Irene is a Vanguard enjoyer, speed is yet another point in her favor. If an operator cannot use Vanguard A or Sniper A, or doesn't want to, it's likely that I've placed them lower as a result. And that's about it when it comes to Irene. But as we get into the tier list, I want you to think about how each operator fulfills or doesn't fulfill these attributes. You'll also notice that I left out many operators. That's because I focused on carry operators, the ones who are doing most of the heavy lifting. As such, I won't be talking about vanguards, supporters, with notable exceptions, or support characters. Keep in mind that I judged everything based on their performance in emergency mode, because you should be playing emergency since it allows you to farm SSS faster. On screen will be some extra information, but to start us off, in the S tier we have the G squad: Golden Glow, Genosis, and Javiel the Invincible. Golden Glow does massive damage and slows, but being forced into the sniper buff means her uptime is meh. Use S3 because the slow is insane and she synergizes well with other sniper snackers. Very easy to use and strong, highly recommended if you're a bunny boy with a thing for electricity. Genosis with the 5 snipers can permanently freeze any enemy without skills. He amps damage and can buy you precious time in critical moments. But as broken as this is, you will need to bring someone with thick damage in order to interrupt his thought process. Javiel the Invincible's greatest strength is how down bad I am for her, and the fact that she can rock any combination of buffs and still be incredible. This means that all the trash I was telling you to remove from your squad in part 1 suddenly has a new purpose in life. I usually don't recommend her as she's a limited unit, but if you have her, I just want you to know that she's mine. Moving on to the A tier. First up is Suran, basically a worse Gnosis because her CC, damage, and uptime aren't as good. I often use S3 because it buys so much time, but regardless of what you're doing, Suran is still fantastic, just not as good as G-Man. Activate Munar's skill. Null the Radiant Knight. Alright, I should probably mention something about Munar. You might think that Vanguard A charging Munar's skill faster would be bad. It's not, he still deletes everything. However, he has no CC, so he's A tier. Nulta is basically worse Irene because her CC, damage, and uptime aren't as good. The only place she's truly better is against thick enemies who cannot be levitated, but I wouldn't recommend Nulta over Irene in those scenarios. I would bring both of them and sandwich myself in between. Chain casters are fantastic because they slow on hit with no downtime whatsoever. The only problem is that their damage isn't great, so they pair well with big DPS operators. This is a very good strat I use as my default when I farm SSS, and I'll be talking about this particular strategy more in part 3 if you're interested. I'd highly recommend this if you're new because the red search shop gives you access to put in these nuts in your mouth. Also a side note, I don't recommend caster stacking Passenger, and you can read about why on screen now. Let's move on to the mid tier, and while I didn't include her on the list, yes, She is. Chalta does damage, but not as much as Weena, and either her uptime or team play are Stainless is a very fun operator in SSS if you combo him with Flinger Snipers, but ultimately he's a lot of work for not that much. Carnelian has the same problems as Chalta, except she's also not my type. Chongyue does decent damage, but his lack of immediate impact and no crowd control means he heavily relies on teammates with crowd control or getting extremely lucky. Eunictus is kinda like Gaviolta, but worse. Just don't tell her I said that because she might start wearing clothes just to spite me. Holom's biggest downside is awful uptime, which struggles to sync up with other operators' skill rotations. However, even with 5 snipers, her damage is pretty good, so I guess she's just okay. Reed the Flame Shadow has pretty good damage, however with no CC and limited sniper synergy, I'd rather bring Vanguard Reed. Spalter the Unspaltered is pretty in emergency mode, but she's still Spalter, who at the very least is just okay. Silver Ash is pretty copium, but still does okay damage early on. However, as we continue to march onwards to our inevitable deaths, I expect him to decrease in value due to power creep. Bybeak can stall things for a very long time if you hate your wrists and don't mind developing carpal tunnel syndrome. For your own sake, don't try this at home. W relies on caster A to do anything, but when set up, the damage and CC is there! Plus she only has 2 red flags, but if you like W, you're probably into that anyways. Mizuki is quite good, however his greatest weakness is that his damage comes out really slowly, so I generally avoid him in the effort to not question my sexuality again. Mudrock doesn't really do anything against threatening enemies, but she does block 3, which should not be underestimated. She's alright, but doesn't make SSS easier for new players. Penance is kind of the same deal, except she does way more damage, but personally her ass brings me no joy. And now the probably don't tier. Aya does damage but falls short in every other category. Her S3 nukes but has bad uptime, and her S2 makes me depressed. Unfortunately in SSS, Aya is still a sheep in sheep's clothing. Horn's damage has no way of ignoring defense, so in later stages her damage becomes the equivalent of banging a triangle in an audition for the London Symphony Orchestra. Mostima is generally awful, however S3 is kinda like Suzerain S3, just infinitely worse. Don't tell her I said that though, because... Oh hi Mostima. No, I wasn't saying anything. Weedy can also buy you precious time, but I'd never rely on this because, quite frankly, sanitizing my left nut every time I need to go within 5 meters of her is a hassle. Kayabi is great against high defense enemies, but when the enemies don't have very high defense, she is quite literally dog. Fear Meta will kill herself faster than you will after you fail an SSS run with her. I'd advise against her if it was not for the fact that she is literally the embodiment of suffering. And finally we have Tubai, who is a disappointment. I'm joking of course, she's fine, I just have a vendetta against RNG and a certain redhead who did a factory reset on my preferences. Use S2 if you don't want to suffer, it does a lot of damage. And now we're on to the don't tier, reserved for operators that only insane people use. That being said, my placement of them in this tier does come from experience. The Serta Hospital is a valid strategy that pains me greatly, although I will concede that fighting an Adderall smoked hornet's nest with an amnesiac sarcasm woman high on 7-year-old Chinese incense sticks infused with crack is a thing that you could do. Calcit is bad because you are a strong, independent doctor who doesn't need an immortal dustbin telling you what to do. Summons don't benefit from tactical equipment, so summoners are a pass. Kirin R. Texas and Yato the Omatosa can work by stacking big attack buffs onto a tile and chaining the Specialist A equipment. If that sounds awfully scuffed, you'd be wrong. It's actually worse, because it made me want to tear myself a new asshole just so I could crawl inside and briefly escape this miserable existence, which happens to be another red flag of mine. And finally we have Thorns, who is borderline useless in almost all difficult content, including SSS. If you want your SSS to be easier, please don't take Thorns. And we're done! Time flies, doesn't it? If you want to know my thoughts about anything I didn't cover, comment below and I'll get back to you in like 3 months. I'll also remind you that part 3 is the live commentary where I showcase everything I've been teaching you up until this point, but for now, remember this. Roses are red, enemies are dead, Ursus Big Bread, Irene's forehead.